Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. Hello, and on today's episode of Afternoon Light, I'm talking to Gary Humphries, who is a former Liberal Senator for the ACT from 2003 to 13 and former ACT Chief Minister from 2000 to 2001. And the reason we are having a discussion today is to talk about the history of the ACT and its journey to self-government. And this is the subject of Gary's current preoccupation, which is a PhD on this very topic. So lovely to be here at the ANU in the ACT with you, Gary.
It's my pleasure, Georgina.
And you're a true Canberran.
Yes, I suppose so, although very few people of my generation were born here. But yes, I came here about 10 years before I got elected to the ACT Parliament. Interestingly, of the 17 members of the first Parliament, only one was actually born in Canberra.
Right.
So we are a city of carpetbaggers, let's face it, people who come from somewhere else, at least of my generation.
Yeah. But, I mean, it has evolved into a very serious city, not least, of course, our nation's capital. But it's a curiosity. I mean, some countries do have purpose-built capitals, like the United States has Washington, D.C. The capital of Myanmar is purpose-built. I think they're building a new capital city in Indonesia. So these do exist. But when you play the capitals game, it's always the trick question, what's the capital of Australia to someone not from Australia? Well, hopefully all Australians know Canberra is the capital. But can you tell me how we came to have Canberra and not Sydney or Melbourne as our nation's capital? It's a story worth remembering and reflecting on.
Yeah, it is. And of course, the 6 colonies hadn't quite envisaged what their future would be. In fact, some of them imagined at the end of the 19th century that they'd be separate countries. That's why today, for example, you've got the National Gallery of Victoria. Not because it's a national gallery, but because Victorians at the end of the 19th century thought that they would be a nation called Victoria.
I never knew that.
Yeah, similarly...
Just thought it was presumptuous.
Yeah, no. The NRMA in New South Wales, National Roads and Motorist Association, is only a New South Wales body. It was set up on the assumption that New South Wales would be a nation as well.
Wow.
So, yeah, it wasn't clear, but of course Henry Parkes sort of sparked this idea of federation. The idea caught on and a lot of people were in favour of it. But at the first referendum, New South Wales voted no. The Premier, George Reid, wasn't in favour of it. He needed to be cajoled, and the incentive they gave him was that we'll build a new purpose-built capital. It won't be Sydney, it won't be Melbourne, too much rivalry there. It'll be in New South Wales, but it has to be at least 100 miles away from Sydney. So on the premise of that, Reid said, yes, I'll vote for federation. New South Wales came in, and federation happened in 1901.
Surely there were more convincing reasons than, you can get the capital in your state. That seems...
well, I'd like to think there were, but...
a more important decision than just the location of the capital city.
But Sydney and Melbourne were serious rivals, and there was debate about which should be the capital, and they couldn't settle it.
So that was the determining factor for George Reid's agreement to the concept of federation. So Canberra, of course, is selected. It's more than 100 miles, which is 160 kilometres, I think, with my conversion here, from Sydney. How was the site chosen?
With great difficulty.
No doubt.
There were wagon loads of senators and members who traipsed across New South Wales looking at various locations. Bathurst Orange was in the frame at one stage. They were looking at the coast, but decided that this was too dangerous because Russian warships could come close to the coast and bombard the capital, which wasn't acceptable, so inland it had to be. At the end of the day, in 1908, the 2 finalists were Tumut and Yass Canberra, as it was called, and Canberra won by 1 vote. It was very close. Almost Tumut was going to be our national capital.
And was this voted by the Parliament?
Yes, the Parliament voted, yes. Both houses voted, and narrowly went to Canberra.
This place, Dalgety, I understand that was the site originally chosen for Canberra, and rumour has it that the Victorians had picked that site because it was so bad. They thought, because Parliament obviously was sitting in Melbourne prior to Canberra, old Parliament House being built here, So they chose this terrible, terrible site thinking, oh, Parliament will never move to Dalgety because it's a terrible site. Anyway, obviously.
Yeah, that's true.
George Reid got wind of that, clearly.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Oh, no, it was Carruthers. I apologise. By that stage, the Premier of New South Wales was Joseph Carruthers, and he didn't like that idea in the end, which is fair enough.
And to be fair, I mean, many federal politicians didn't really envisage the new capital being very much at all. Deakin, for example, thought it would basically be a temporary city. People would come to this place for the meetings of the National Parliament and they'd all go home, and the place would be sort of boarded up more or less between sittings. So he didn't have much of an idea of it. King O'Malley, of course, at the other extreme, compared Canberra to Chicago, Paris, Athens. So this would be a magnificent city, bigger than any other Australian city.
Wow.
There were two extremes there, unfortunately for the first sort of 30 or 40 years of Canberra's existence as the national capital after 1927, it did tend more towards Deakin's vision than O'Malley's. The city was very small, just 20 or 30,000 people for the first 40 years of its existence, and was barely much bigger than a country town.
So why was that? Was that because there was a lack of ambition from the Parliament, from the government?
Yeah, look, a number of things. I mean, 2 world wars and a depression didn't help, but there was also the feeling that we fulfil the constitutional obligations, but we really want to sort of put much money into this artificial country town come capital city. Let the Parliament go there and meet, and the members and senators can put up with drafty rooms and so on, and then they'll come back to normal Australia, and let's just leave it as that kind of constitutional concept.
Yes.
And really didn't think anything more was needed for a long, long time.
And government departments, were they all in Canberra? Because, I mean, I did a podcast a little while back with David Bird, who's a historian and expert on Joe Lyons, has written books on Joe Lyons. He was saying that Joe Lyons, before becoming Prime Minister, was Postmaster General or Minister for Postal Services. And he actually, it was in Melbourne.
That's right.
Yes, it was in Melbourne.
Yeah.
The Postmaster General's department.
Yeah.
So
more departments were in Melbourne than in Sydney.
Yes.
For some reason. I suppose because the federal capital was Melbourne for the first 27 years. And right until the 1950s, early 60s, there were probably more public servants in Melbourne than there were in Canberra. But of course it was Menzies who made the decision that this wasn't acceptable. And there's the famous story that Heather, his daughter, was pushing the pram with Patty, her mum, along the Canberra streets, and there were barely any footpaths, and the pram was rocking and so on. And she said, "Mum, you've got to talk to Dad about this." And apparently she did, and for whatever reason, Menzies decided that the capital needed to be a proper capital. And as one author put it, he was originally very much opposed to Canberra, saw it as a place of hardship as a young parliamentarian. But when he became Prime Minister, he went from being an apostle of a national capital to the High Priest. And he was passionately in favour of it and said, right, we're going to do this properly. He'd already set up the Snowy Hydroelectric Authority to force march the hydroelectric scheme into existence. And he said, we'll do the same thing in Canberra. And he created the National Capital Development Commission, was given sweeping powers to do whatever it wanted, and it built suburbs and roads and schools and shopping centres. The lake.
Yes.
Everything happened. Of course, there was no local government, so planning controls were just laid out by the NCDC. They did what they wanted. And the city flourished. So in the space of about 20 years, it sort of grew from about 28,000, 30,000 people to 200,000 odd people.
Wow. So this was a builder's paradise.
It was. And it was growing like topsy. And, I mean, people had to be enticed here. I mean, people from Melbourne were very reluctant to come. The departments always found a reason why they had to stay in Melbourne. There was important networks and synergies and whatever. But eventually they were persuaded no, Canberra had to go. They were sort of dragged here. But they had to make the city livable. So got very special services, very high quality infrastructure. Every suburb had a school. Every school had its own oval. There were toll-free roads. There were health centres. Very high standard to make it, not just because it had to be a good-looking national capital, but because it had to bring public servants who were otherwise reluctant to the city.
And the population, when it was growing from 28,000 to 200,000, was that almost all public servants? Because, I mean, these days Canberra's population is incredibly diverse, but presumably back then those 200,000...
It was mainly public servants and the services that they depended on, almost entirely. very small, independent private sector. But that's the nature of Canberra, and it is much more diverse these days because that diversity of interests and so on and activities, the diplomats, the universities being here, has created a very interesting, diverse city. And so you've got this range of activities from the national institutions all the way through to a thriving pornographic industry, and the Summer Nats Street Machine Festival every summer.
Yes.
Where the
real diversity of interest there.
Absolutely. It's a capital for everybody these
Porn,
days.
cars, books.
That's right.
History.
Everything you want.
Yes. The plan for Canberra, though, and we obviously have what we now call Old Parliament House, it was then just Parliament House, opened in 1928. 27, apologies. I mean, beautiful, beautiful building. I was there yesterday, and you can never quite get the same magic in new Parliament House. But anyway, it obviously, Parliament outgrew the size of that building. But the National Capital Development Commission, were they responsible for the design? Were there ministers who were driving, needed all these big institutions, the National Gallery, the National Library, the Archives, the War Memorial? Were they driven by the government? Or?
There were sort of several phases of Canberra's development, and a kind of a seat of government concept prevailed originally, which is the capital is just about government, and anything that's extraneous to that we don't worry about. So all that was here for the first dozen years or so was the Parliament and a couple of administrative support units, and that was it, was the Parliament, that was it. At the end of the First World War, it was realised that we needed a national monument to honour the dead of the war, and they decided the only place for that should be the national capital, so the Australian War Memorial was built and opened in 1941. But again, for the next 20 years, they were basically the only national features of Canberra, the Parliament and the War Memorial. And it was Menzies' decision to create the NCDC that led to all the other things we see today.
Yes.
The National Library, the High Court, and ultimately the new Parliament House, which was a major innovation of the federal government. All of these things came about because it was realised that you had to bring these things, make these things happen in the national capital. And in the intervening years, the city's grown to accommodate those things and be a showcase. And it's succeeded, but very lately. I mean, very much an afterthought. I mean, Washington had its monuments very early on. They were seen as appropriate there from the beginning, but in Canberra's case, they had to be kind of forced into the system rather than growing naturally.
The museums, so the National Gallery and the National Museum, obviously the War Memorial, and there's been huge investments in making that museum there a highly, highly visitable place. It's incredible, and will be even more incredible once Anzac Hall's open. This makes Canberra the place to showcase your nation's stories.
That's right. I think of Canberra as like that room in your house. Maybe it's your living parlour or whatever. The good room. You're basically being the visitors.
Yeah.
Place with you got the pictures of the family traditions or the ancestors or whatever, the special room in your house. And it should be a nice place, a pleasant place to sort of to reflect on who you are and what made you. And that's what I think Canberra really is today. I mean, it's like most national capitals, it has its more than fair share of people who have contempt for it and equate it with the federal government of the day.
Yeah.
Fair enough. Every capital city suffers that fate. But Canberra is a particularly successful capital because it's a planned city. It's one of the most beautifully designed cities in the world. Unlike Washington, which has a magnificent core, but quite a lot of poverty outside the boundaries of DC. Canberra's kept a great balance with its environment. Everywhere is close to the bush. You can sort of see the bush defining the nation just metres away from the monuments of the city. It's got a high standard of living, a very high education level. People are politically literate, of course. And it was a hardship post years ago. Today it's seen as a great place. And those who live here sort of know the secret. They love it and want to stay here.
So I guess your answer to this question is going to be yes, I expect so. But Menzies' vision for having a grand showcase capital as opposed to the alternative Deakin vision of just having a place to meet when Parliament sits and then go back to your electorate and not bother too much about the rest, has been a success.
I think so.
Yes.
I think at every level it's been a success. I mean, the city serves the national government and the National Parliament, and some would say it should be more focused on other activities. If you had more commerce here, public service would be better able to understand the needs of business than it does. I don't think that's an argument with much weight. I think the city has succeeded as a city focused on government, but it's always been outward looking. As a relatively small city in Australia, it's depended on people from other parts of Australia to make it work.
Well, as you said, most of the population are carpetbaggers.
Yeah, that's right.
Or less and less so now, I guess. Yeah. But this sort of idea that the public servants are just Canberra people sitting there, rubbing their hands together, cooking up what to do to the rest of the country while having no contact with them is untrue. Yeah. You're all coming from interstate to live here and work in the government. You bring with you the experiences from wherever you come.
Yeah. When I was a Member of Parliament myself, I'd be interviewed by interstate media and they'd say, well, Canberra's decided to do this, haven't they? And I would say, no, actually, Brisbane, you're from Brisbane, Brisbane's decided to do this. And they said, what are you talking about? I said, well, Canberra has 5 members of the federal parliament, or actually 4 in those days, 4 members of the federal parliament. Brisbane has like 35. Yeah. So it's more true to say that Brisbane's made this decision than Canberra has, Brisbane people have contributed to that. So, and as a small city, it's been very dependent on its interface with other parts of the country and indeed other parts of the world. The embassies here have made a contribution to the outward-looking focus of the city, and the things that should be important to the city are important, but they're also focused on the national story. And Canberra isn't insular, it's not self-absorbed, as I think some people imagine it might be. It is very much focused on what's going on across the rest of the country.
Which is good, and I hope you're right. But now talking about things that are about being self-absorbed, let's get on to self-government. Yes. So I could not believe this. I feel incredibly ignorant that I did not realise that Canberra did not have its own government until 1989, which is extraordinary. So until then, the federal government ostensibly ran Canberra. Yep. And you had various calls along the way for self-government, I think in the 70s, and there was always a reason why it wasn't going to be possible. Yes. Basically dollars.
Yeah, always a reason. And the Liberal governments before 1972 didn't want self-government because they wanted the NCDC to be creating this magnificent city, and if the locals got involved in planning controls, well, that bulldozing kind of vision would be at risk. Whitlam didn't want self-government for an entirely different reason. He wanted to sort of take over urban planning across the country, and he got Tom Uren to head up this Department of Urban and Regional Development, which was going to be about remodelling Australian cities, and the federal government would be the leader in that exercise. But they needed a place where they could show that they could do this. So Canberra was the social laboratory where they could run integrated health systems with community amenity, infant health clinics and all the things that go into a proper city as Whitlam saw it.
Was that popular, that sort of idea that the federal government would be running urban planning?
In certain quarters it was.
Yeah.
I mean, there were lots and lots of bad decisions by state and local governments around the country that people could point to and say, look how badly we do if we don't have centralised planning of our cities. There's a point to that argument, I suppose. But
so it takes the decision of how people live their lives right away from them to a distant location, to Canberra.
That's right. Exactly.
If I lived in, I don't know, in Perth, in Margaret River or somewhere, I wouldn't want Canberra to be telling me how to create my landscapes and
indeed. And,
town design.
And Whitlam's sort of vision kind of died with him. He didn't go any further than that. Yeah. But because he wanted a city that the federal government could sort of use as a showcase, he also didn't want locals getting involved in making their own decisions. No, it was a federal
especially
vision.
As the locals had been working for 23 years of Liberal government, so he probably was a bit sceptical of those locals.
Yes, probably as well.
Yes.
Fraser wasn't all that keen on it because Bob Ellicott, his Territories Minister, had a vision of expansion. The federal government was expanding here. They're doing the Australian Institute of Sport, the High Court, and ultimately New Parliament House. And they saw this as a place where they could create a grand vision, so it was a kind of an extension of the social laboratory idea. But in 83, Hawke came to power, and Hawke's preoccupation was, well, economic rationalism was sort of sweeping over the world at that stage, no less the Hawke-Keating kind of mentality. And they were saying, well, what does the federal government need to do? What can it contract out? What can it get rid of? And all the principles of sort of economic rationalism said that the federal government shouldn't be running a municipal setting, even though it's the national capital. It's big enough and mean enough to look after itself these days. The other thing was costing them an arm and a leg. The Grants Commission had discovered that the average Commonwealth subvention to a citizen of Canberra was about 50% higher than a citizen of Sydney or Melbourne.
Right.
And the federal government said, well, we don't need to lavish money on the city anymore. The public servants have been moved here. They're happy here. It's time to cut back what we're spending on Canberra to what we're spending on other cities.
Because when you think about it, the federal government was having to run all the schools here, the
Yes.
roads here, the garbage collection here, absolutely everything would have been run by a government department that just for Canberra, whereas in other states they were run by the state government or the local councils.
That's right. And the Minister for the Capital Territory, and whatever title they had over the years, had a power which ministers generally didn't have. He could do anything he wanted in his domain, and it was usually meant. So.
And Gary, what was the situation in the Northern Territory then? Did they have their own self-government where the ACT did not?
They'd had local government for quite a long time. Canberra didn't even have local government. And they got territory government in 1978 under the Fraser government. So Fraser gave them self-government. He gave Norfolk Island self-government. All 2,000 people on Norfolk Island were self-governing.
And the poor Canberrans didn't get anything.
I mean, Whitlam had given Papua New Guinea self-government.
They were their own country.
Well, they weren't at that stage, but they became,
So,
but Canberra wasn't for various reasons. And eventually it was that universal question, the cost, that began to force the question of, well, we're going to have to cut back in Canberra. Who's going to make those decisions? Well, we're not going to make them. We're going to let the locals decide what services have to be cut and what taxes have to be raised to pay for this very expensive city.
So what broke this trend to deny Canberra self-government?
The federal Labor government decided it wanted to do it. It was driven largely by Peter Walsh, who was a very old-fashioned penny pincher in the best traditions of Liberal finance ministers and treasurers. So he was very much in favour of getting rid of this dreadfully draining asset. So he wanted it. There was a big stoush about the electoral system. Canberra is very homogenous. We don't have the sort of the big pockets of wealth and poverty that you find in other Australian cities. And what that means is that because there's very little variation in how each suburb tends to vote. And so where generally speaking the Labor Party enjoys a more support than the Liberal Party, with single member electorates, which is what the Labor Party had preferred up until that point, it's quite likely that Labor would have won all or almost all of the seats in an ACT parliament.
Right.
So the Liberal Party and the National Party and the Australian Democrats were in favour of proportional representation. But the federal Labor government didn't want to do this because they didn't see it as being to the best advantage of the local Labor Party. And there was an attempt in the mid-80s to get self-government, and it failed because the electoral system was unacceptable. It was blocked in the Senate. And then Gary Punch was the Territories Minister, and he said, stuff this. He said to the local Labor Party, you're getting self-government, but you're getting it with a proportional representation system so we can get it through the Senate. You can sort out afterwards what system you want once you're self-governing. And indeed, that got through the Senate. So late 1988, the legislation passed, and the first election was held in March of 1989.
So are you saying that the ACT legislature could actually change from proportional representation?
Not initially.
But now they could.
Now they can, yes. It was very tightly controlled because the federal government knew that this was unpopular. People in the ACT were well aware that when they got self-government, it was going to be accompanied by a reduction in Commonwealth spending. And the role of the self-governing territory was going to be how to make the cuts and tax increases to pay for this shortfall in Commonwealth spending. And so they didn't like it, and they voted accordingly at that first election. And in March of 89, the two major parties barely got a majority of the seats between them. The other half of the parliament was made up of the Residents' Rally for Canberra, the No Self-Government Party, and the Abolish Self-Government Coalition, who committed to abolishing this very body to which they'd just been elected.
Right.
So it was chaos.
So did people in Canberra not generally, I mean, they were voting for these parties, so was it more than 50% who didn't want self-government, do you think?
That's a $64,000 question. Nobody,
Right.
look, people weren't happy with it. Some people say, well, more people voted for the traditional major parties than voted for the sort of the new anti-self-government type parties, so therefore people must have been in favour of it. But the fact is a lot of people were holding their noses and voting for Liberal or Labor. They didn't like what had happened. Big resentment to what had occurred. One political science interviewed said people were having their fun with the system. They didn't like it. They gave it a joke first assembly in order to put it up the federal government. But after the first assembly, they realised that, well, this actually is a serious business. We've got to make some hard decisions. Let's go back towards the major party system. And it's been like that ever since.
So the sun-ripened warm tomato party and the surprise party didn't last beyond that first ACT election?
No, they didn't.
Saying?
No.
I
I like the party. That was also one of my favourites. So yes, there was quite a lot of derision around the first election. But I feel sorry for the No Self-Government Party people because they got elected. Their one mission was to abolish the parliament they've just been elected to. They couldn't abolish it because majority of people were in favour of carrying on. And in the end, one of their members became the Speaker of the first Parliament. Another became a minister in the first Parliament. And they were kind of thrashing about, what do we do? Well, we can't abolish it. We might as well make it work better. So we'll get involved in running the place and making the engineering of the place work.
Well, they ended up being fairly practical about
Well,
the situation.
in a way you could say they were, yes.
Yeah. So the first government in 1989 was formed by the Labor Party,
Yes.
I understand. But then it was pretty unstable, ACT governments, for a bit.
Very unstable. And again, you see, the members were thrashing about trying to work out their role. We'd elected people on the premise of being for or against self-government, but discovered that some of the people who'd been elected had their own agendas. So the Speaker, for example, was very passionately opposed to fluoride in the water supply. And he moved a bill which succeeded in removing fluoride from the water supply.
Oh, so everyone has bad teeth here.
Well, they did, but as soon as this happened, it was alarm. This joke assembly had now done something which we were really quite concerned about, and people were sort of shocked about this.
Dentists would have been up and
Dentists, yes. So the assembly, and we worked out we accidentally defluoridated the water supply of Queanbeyan at the same time.
Oh,
and
so
they were
Queanbeyan
upset
has
about
bad
it.
teeth too.
Yes, but eventually it was realised this was a bit of a mistake, so the fluoride was put back in the water supply.
Right. I grew up on rainwater, so I remember going to the dentist and being given fluoride tablets in order to stave off terrible decay.
Yeah,
I was so worried about the lack of fluoride in our rainwater tank.
Yes. No, well, we had to fix that problem. But so the first government only lasted 7 months. Incidentally, I mean, the thing was still quite revolutionary. I mean, this was the first government in Australia that was created without the use of a viceroy, a governor or an administrator or a governor-general. There was that kind of republican process was built into the system.
Very Canberra.
Very Canberra. It was the first government in Australia led by a woman.
Sorry, so the Northern Territory did have a viceroy?
Oh, yes.
Right.
It did then. It still has an administrator.
I see.
Who is the equivalent of a state governor or governor-general. Even Norfolk Island has an administrator.
Yes. Gary Humphries was another Gary.
Another Gary, that's right. So that's been the traditional model. But the Labor Party, I mean, again, wanting to reduce the cost was probably the main reason. Might have been a little bit of republicanism in there as well. But
no doubt.
They said, no, we don't need an administrator. That's a fancy thing. We don't need that. The Assembly can elect the Chief Minister. We don't need somebody else to intervene. And it did. But ever since, it's been evolving new ways of doing things. So
court system? So it has a...
It has a court, yes. We have a court system. We appoint our own Supreme Court, but it's a relatively flat structure, and we've had many innovations in the way the court system works because it's small enough to be able to do that. The ACT Parliament was the first one to have a majority of women in it. After the first election, there was a referendum on the new electoral system. People voted for proportional representation rather than single-member electorates, so that's been entrenched. We've had many innovations in that time. The first woman to head a Liberal government was in the ACT with Kate Carnell. So it's been a place which has sort of grappled with that sort of spirit of innovation and change. Even though the concept wasn't popular, people have used it to do things which they probably wouldn't have been able to do if we'd still been a department of the federal government.
And it's a unicameral system. So how are deadlocks resolved then?
Well, there were 17 members originally, there's now 25. Got to get a majority. It's as simple as that.
Right.
It's also state and local government rolled into one. So the ACT government appoints Supreme Court judges and fixes the potholes in the street. That full gamut of government services. And the other thing that's interesting about it is that generally speaking, they've been minority governments or coalition governments. There's only been one instance of a single party majority government in Canberra's 34-year history. Only one. And I think that's a deliberate kind of decision by the territory voters to say, if we're going to have self-government, we want a system where no one party has complete control. We want a balanced system. You get that often in state parliaments where an upper house might not be the same persuasion as the lower house, and so there's a bit of a break on excessive decision-making by government. In the ACT's case, it's been built into the one chamber, and I think people like the idea that whichever party runs the government has to answer to at least a crossbench which isn't of their persuasion.
The downside of not having single-member electorates is that you might end up with all your members of the legislature being from the same suburb, different parties, but they could all live in a very, very small defined area by chance or by design.
Yeah.
Canberra's not that big a territory.
No.
But it's probably something to worry about, maybe more to worry about in a place like the Northern Territory, which is obviously a much larger landmass covered by their borders. But is there ever any scepticism about, the ACT government is very, South Canberra-centric or North Canberra-centric, or that doesn't come into play?
It can sometimes be a factor. North Canberra swings very much to the left. It's, in fact, at the last federal election, the candidate for the seat of Canberra, which covers North Canberra, came in third behind the Labor Party and the Greens. That's how sort of much to the left it swings. And so there's sometimes a complaint that kind of inner city, trendy kind of people kind of run the show. But look, no, mostly it's not considered a problem. We've now got five member seats. And they're sort of, the local members identify with their areas and they're passionate about their areas. And I don't think people feel they're not being represented well by that arrangement. It does mean, though, that when you've got a problem, you can go to a person who's a party that you trust. They might be in opposition. You can still go and talk to them, and they're your local member. You don't have to worry about not having a local member that's of your persuasion. So I think it's a fairly balanced system. It's the same system as used in Tasmania. In Tasmania,
complicated voting system.
Same complicated voting system.
Hare Clark, isn't it?
Hare Clark, that's right, with the Robson rotation. So every ballot paper is different. Your ballot paper is different from your wife's ballot paper, etc. But whereas you tend to get majority governments in Tasmania, in the ACT you tend not to get them. And again, it's by design. I think the ACT community wants a system where government is accountable. And you could say that that's a phenomenon happening across the whole country these days. I mean, increasingly governments are failing to get to majorities. Major party votes are slipping back all the time. And so people are expecting parties to work together in the European style rather than the tradition of two parties we've had for such a long time in Australia. So again, the ACT kind of leads the way with that. We've had a Labor-Greens government in place now for 2 terms, at least, maybe 3 terms, and whatever you think about it, it's been stable. It hasn't had major problems. It's delivered stable government and it works. And I think that's in many ways a pointer to how we might cope in the future where people no longer want majority government as a matter of course.
But I guess Canberra ACT government is running a population of 400,000 people, quite a small territory. The issues tend to be more local government issues in the main. I mean, obviously you have schools here and some social issues and energy issues that you make your own policies on. But it's easier, surely, when you're dealing with a small area, a small number of people to have negotiated outcomes when you're dealing with the nation, with defence and those things, and you're having to do cross-party negotiations on some of the really, really, really existential issues of the nation. You wonder whether a negotiated outcome is, the best, or do you just choose one view and vote for the party with that view and know what you're going to get at the end? Yeah,
well, look, there's a philosophical question there about what's the best way of exercising power. And my way of viewing it is that the way in which Western democracies have developed is that they've moved away from the absolute power of monarchs towards a diversified system where there are two houses and they've both got to get agreement, and you've got various checks and balances. And a balanced system, a system where there's constraints on power, is sometimes frustrating and prevents good decisions being made, but ultimately it's the better state of affairs to have.
Sure.
And I think that reflects in the way that people are viewing parliaments. They're more and more investing in upper house members who are not the same persuasion as lower house members because they want constraints on power exercised by governments in the lower house.
Of course. And I take your point about the importance of checks and balances and constraining absolute power. But in terms of Australian people, for example, vote for the member in their electorate who will be potentially part of a party that forms government with a majority in the House of Representatives. You then, if you're voting, say, Labor, they have a policy agenda, that's what they will be pushing for if they get the majority in the House of Reps and form government. You sort of know what you're going to get. Whereas if you have 6 different parties coming together, the outcome on policy decisions can be uncertain. The Labor members may be pushing for policy X, but then the 5 other parties they've formed in coalition with may push them to have policy Y. You then don't necessarily get a certain outcome when it comes to what the government will do that you're voting for.
Yeah. I think that's true. But I think we have a tradition, though, of powerful governments in Australia, which people are less satisfied with than they once were. And we have to look to other systems where a more diversified power structure works. And Europe's a good example. Most of the European parliaments operate with coalition governments because for a variety of reasons they don't have majoritarian governments and they need to work together. And decades of that kind of tradition has forced them to work together and to make arrangements which are reasonably cohesive and stable and give people what they want. Now, there are some examples where it doesn't happen. I mean, Italy and perhaps Israel and places
Belgium
like that.
seems to...
Belgium,
didn't they go for sort of 3 years without forming a government?
Yes, that's right. So there are examples where this doesn't work very well. There are other places where it works brilliantly well and where people don't feel as if the government is drifting because it has to be a negotiation between 2 or 3 or maybe 4 parties. If we create expectation that there'll be cooperation, there'll be discussion and so on, I think that will be satisfying to voters and it'll force the system to be responsive. It'll force the system to design ways of giving people effective outcomes by a process of negotiation rather than executive fiat. And we aren't there yet, but I think that's where we're tending in Australia. And my forecast is that's where we'll end up in 20 or 30 or 40 years' time.
Interesting. Well, watch this space, I guess, for elections to come. I just wanted to finish our discussion today, Gary, by asking you about this reputation that Canberra has as a Labor town. In the House of Reps, in the federal parliament, all the lower house members are from the Labor Party. And the Senate, you have 2 senators, and neither of them are from the Liberal Party. As of the last year's election, you have David Pocock and you have, and I've forgotten the other one, but it's a Labor senator.
Katie Gallagher.
Of course, Katie Gallagher. How could I forget? And also a former Chief Minister of the ACT as well. So it was a good training ground for the Senate, clearly.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, you look at the figures, the ACT government has almost always been led by a Labor Chief Minister, aside from yourself and Kate Carnell in 1995. It certainly seems to be bearing true that the reputation that Canberra is a Labor town. How do Liberals survive here? Can Menzies Liberal Party ever get a look in when it comes to governing in their territory?
Well, I think the Menzies Liberal Party certainly can. I see Menzies as an extremely pragmatic person who read the mood of the electorate brilliantly and did so well that he was in government for the better part of 20 years. And I think that's the great strength of the Liberal Party. It should have the capacity to read the electorate and to respond to what the electorate wants better than a more ideological party, which is the Labor Party. We have one in the past here because we've responded to that need to deal with Canberra values and Canberra issues and the way government works. So Kate Carnell won 2 elections and it meant being more progressive, not in the traditional Liberal mould to do that. Kate, for example, was in favour of very radical reform of drug policy. She wanted to establish a supervised injecting facility and to trial the supply of heroin to registered addicts. She was in favour of regulating prostitution so that it wasn't illegal anymore. She was very much atypical, but she spoke to Canberra values and we won twice. And I think that says that although Canberrans do swing to the progressive end of the spectrum a bit more than other Australians, they also want outcomes. They want practical results. They want a party which gives them what they need. And they won't necessarily go to the Labor Party to get that if they think the Liberal Party can provide it.
Right.
So we haven't won an election here at the territory level for quite a long time. My view is because we haven't heeded that message about being attached to Canberra values. We need to sort of rethink that position. But there's a Liberal leader at the moment, Elizabeth Lee, who is a Korean-born young female lawyer who does understand, I think, that that's what the party needs to do. And I think our chances are much better as a result of that mindset. But we do have to work harder, there's no doubt about it. If we're seen as being about as effective as the Labor Party will win. If we can go that extra mile and work with what Canberrans want, we can win.
And at the federal level, in the Senate, to not have any representation in the party room from the ACT is, I mean, that's pretty tough going.
It's tragic, really. But again, I think that result at the last election where we lost our Senate seat was a kind of a commentary on self-government, because the Liberal senator went to the election saying, in a sense, talking to the Canberrans of 30 years ago who wanted the federal government to keep running Canberra. And he was saying to them in 2022, the federal parliament is the best body to decide whether the ACT has euthanasia or not. Not the local government, the federal government, the federal parliament can make this decision. And people here, unlike in 1989, said, no, we think the ACT parliament is the best place to make this decision. And as a result of that, he lost his seat because he just wasn't in touch with that sentiment. So in many ways, that election has
So that
cemented,
was really a referendum, you think?
I think it was.
That result on self-government?
In a way it was,
So if you're a senator, aspiring senator in the ACT, you're much more likely to be elected, even if you're a Liberal.
Yeah.
If you advocate for the retention of territory rights.
That's right.
Territory state government.
I don't think there's any doubt about
Self-government,
that. Yeah. That would be my argument. And again, it's a very strong Liberal tradition. I mean, how many times have we seen Liberal state premiers standing up? I'm standing up against what Canberra's trying to do in my state. You know.
It's always electorally very popular.
Absolutely. And we have to remember it. People do identify with their own areas and they want that to be the first priority of the people who represent them at the local level.
Indeed. Well, Gary, this has been an absolute delight and I've learnt an enormous amount about the ACT and its journey to self-government and why we have the institutions that we have here, which, as you say, it makes it a showcase city. It's the good room of Australia.
That's right. It's been a pleasure to talk to you, Georgina. Thank you.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.